100 of the enemy's guns, which score only 1% each, it is evident we sailors must have recourse to strength over and above externals. Togo added, "Heaven gives the crown of victory only to those who by habitual training win without fighting, and forthwith deprives of that crown those who, content with one success, give themselves up to the ways of peace." Togo concluded with this Japanese adage, "Tighten your helmet strings in the hour of victory." For the combined operations necessary for her Pacific conquests, Japan subordinated air and naval units to ground forces. The chief function of the Navy, even when Japan held the offensive, was to act as a troop and supply carrier and escort. The Japanese military thought of fighting in terms of land action. The Navy had the independently important function of protecting home waters and communication lines. Even so, it was not expected to seek full-dress naval action. There have been no signs of a separate strategic air force. The Japanese Army Air Service is an integral part of the Army, while the Japanese Naval Air Service has its own organization under Navy auspices. Despite many defeats by Allied air power, the Japanese air services showed great recuperative strength. Japanese Marines, members of the Rikusentai or Special Naval Landing Forces, go ashore on a dry run. Preparing for the Pacific War, Japan gained experience in surf landings on hostile shores through a series of raids on the China coast during 1940 and 41. Until the late 1920s, naval landing parties were organized temporarily from fleet personnel for a particular mission. This practice was made possible by the fact that every naval recruit was given training in land warfare in seamanship. Because this depleted crews and lowered their efficiency for naval action, Rikusentai units were formed at the 4 major Japanese naval bases. The field uniforms worn by these Marines are similar to those of the Army. For dress, they wear navy blues with canvas leggings. From maneuvers to actual assault of the weakly defended Chinese coast, there seems to be little difference as Japanese naval units stand close inshore without drawing counterfire. In scenes which appear to be authentic, Japanese artillery and infantry operate with little or no opposition. Constant insistence upon the superiority of the offense is the dominant consideration of Japanese infantry tactics. The primary objective is to close with the enemy as soon as possible, so that the assumed inherent superiority of the Japanese soldier in hand-to-hand fighting may be exploited with maximum advantage. Insistence upon the necessity of keeping artillery well forward in support of advancing infantry amounts almost to a fetish with Japanese artillery officers. The enlisted gunners, too, seem eager to demonstrate that they are just as ready as the infantrymen to brave the dangers of front-line combat. Positions are sighted within a few hundred yards of foremost enemy defense points. Command posts, in many cases, are located right beside the guns to make voice control of fire possible. Like this small battery of converted 75mm mountain guns, Japanese artillery is allocated sparingly because combat is conceived as essentially an infantryman's task. Here, in a sequence from a feature motion picture, we see the storming of a Chinese strongpoint by Japanese infantrymen. The fervor of these motion picture extras is not overdone. Japanese tactical theory and practice insistently and egotistically stress the superiority of the Japanese offense. Conduct their own public funerals before leaving for the front. This holds no element of the ridiculous for the Japanese. Rather, it is admired as the spirit of the true samurai who enters the battle with no thought of return unless victorious. The 3 Japanese engineers who carried a live torpedo into a Chinese barbed wire barrier before Shanghai have earned glory and fame in Japan for their self-sacrifice. While evidence adduced at the time indicated that the 3 human bombs were simply victims of a premature explosion, Japanese propagandists elaborated the story for obvious morale reasons. Bronze and stone statues of the suicidal engineers are to be found in shrines all over Japan. To the average Japanese soldier, death is a small price for such immortality. The function of providing support for armored elements and ground troops has been assigned to the Japanese Army Air Service as a major mission. In preparation for this assignment, the pilots got training which resembles the nursing along from bush leagues to minors to majors received by American baseball players. After primary, basic, and advanced training in southern Japan and Manchuria, the typical Japanese pilot was moved to Formosa for operations over the Chinese coast. Next was the Hong Kong Canton area, where he could expect to meet American interception. After a dozen missions there, the pilot went with combat experience to Burma, the Philippines, and the South Pacific Islands. The pilot took the same route home that he took out. He got a rest in Japan, if he got there. The easily stormed walled cities of China were not Japan's only proving ground for the war in the Pacific. In the 2 years before Pearl Harbor, extensive maneuvers in Formosa and Hainan gave the troops familiarity with jungles. Experiments with camouflage later paid off in jungle warfare. The soldier was trained to conceal himself, putting shrubbery around his helmet and pack, disguising his vehicles as well as his... In bivouac, the Japanese officer of company grade shares the rations and discomforts of his men. Actually, despite a very formal system of officer procurement, there isn't too much difference between officers and enlisted personnel. At the Shikwan Gakko, the Japanese West Point, no courses are taught in comparative governments, international law, foreign exchange, or economics. Limited by the narrow confines of his military education, but moved by dreams of Japan's mastery of the world, the typical Japanese officer thinks amazingly like the peasant he commands. It is interesting to note that mail call is received as enthusiastically by the Japanese as it is by American troops. Discipline is good in the Japanese Army. It has to be, for it is the ultimate reflection of the emphasis Japan's military masters place upon the Seishin Kyoiku, or spiritual training of the entire people. The elaborate military training serves as a means to an end. Through the youth of Japan, the Army seeks to build within the nation a denial of self, an ardent loyalty, a devotion that glorifies death for the Emperor as life's greatest reward. The larger purpose is to identify in spirit the Army and the people. Its ultimate goal is to instill the soul of the soldier in the youth and the nation. The Seishin Kyoiku of the soldier is based primarily on the rescript of Emperor Meiji, literally regarded as Holy Writ. It is the religion of the Japanese soldier. For the Army, it has proven a cohesive and motivating force of inestimable value. Commander-in-Chief. Whether we are able to guard the empire depends upon the faithful discharge of your duties as soldiers and sailors. Japanese troops march through the streets of Tokyo en route to the Chinese front. Disciplined and sober in Japan, even during the excitement of embarkation, the typical Japanese soldier demonstrates that he lives by a double code as soon as he sets foot on foreign soil. At home, the soldier is a unit of Japanese society, living in a rigid social framework surrounded by prohibitions. When he is sent abroad, he is taken out of his environment, separated from all his social restraints. He becomes the armed representative of the master race, compensating himself for the inhibitions he endured at home. The contrast between the soldier's unobtrusive behavior in Japan and his conduct abroad has been especially marked in the present war. The Japanese Navy's recent record shows that despite repeated defeats, the fleet has had considerable recuperative power. Japan developed her Navy over the past 70 years with the aid of those very nations at whom she struck in December 1941. It was with a navy built entirely in foreign shipyards that Japan defeated Tsarist Russia in 1904 and 5. In a newsreel sequence, Japanese bluejackets form an honor guard as high Navy and Army officers escort the emperor. Hirohito arrives at an anchorage for a review of the imperial fleet in the harbor of Yokohama. The emperor's barge leaves for the flagship. It is difficult to determine when these scenes were photographed, but it is known that prior to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had a total tonnage of major combat units amounting to about 1 million tons. At the same time, the total seagoing personnel was about 250,000 men. Japan has been a world naval power ever since Admiral Togo, revered as a veritable Nelson in Japan, annihilated the Tsar's Eastern and Baltic fleets. But for 300 years, until Commodore Perry sailed into Yedo Bay, the rulers of feudal Japan had prohibited the building of any seagoing vessels, in the belief they'd expose the nation to dangerous intercourse with the outside world. Curiously, it was a man of war ordered and built in the United States which enabled Emperor Meiji to break the last power of the shogunate and unify his empire. Not until the war with Russia, when Japan found herself unable to purchase more warships from abroad because of a neutrality policy, did Japan determine to try to build her own ships. Since then, the Japanese Navy has been built entirely in Japanese yards, which have produced some of the largest capital ships in the world. The personnel of the Japanese Navy, in general, is of a higher grade than that of the Army. The pressing need for replacements caused by high casualty rates has resulted in a definite lowering of quality of naval personnel. In this sequence from seized Japanese film, we see the completion of a railroad bridge, replacing a bombed Chinese crossing over the Yellow River. Japanese engineers, who are well equipped and armed as infantry, have shown outstanding ability in both the construction and demolition of bridges. They are skilled in the construction of wooden trestle spans, which they can erect with great rapidity from materials prepared beforehand or available locally. Despite their appearance, these improvised trestles are capable of supporting artillery and other heavy equipment. On the other hand, Japanese-built airfields and roads so far encountered do not come up to Allied standards in speed of construction or serviceability. This may be attributed to the fact that the Japanese have depended more on manual labor than on heavy equipment, which they have not taken into forward areas in any quantity. In the Japanese Army Signal Corps, wire communication receives the most emphasis. Radio assumes a secondary role as a standby link after wires have been strung. Before the war, the functions of the Signal Corps were performed by units of the Corps of Engineers. In 1941, however, an Inspectorate of Communications, amounting to a separate Signal Corps, was set up directly subordinate to the War Department General Staff. This Model 92 field telephone is inferior by Allied standards. Japanese troops board a hospital ship bound for their home islands. These soldiers have been identified as wounded of the 10th Infantry Division. Note that the wounded wear their white hospital kimonos with their uniform caps, making them readily recognizable. The Japanese Army Medical Service, which cares for them, is a separate service functioning under the Medical Bureau of the War Ministry. Wounded from China arrive at a Tokyo railroad station. They will be routed to the Army hospitals existing in each home divisional district, which meet the requirements of the various units in peacetime. These, as well as other government and private hospitals, are utilized as base hospitals in wartime. The gauze masks worn by many of these walking wounded are popular in Japan. They're used to prevent the spread of the common cold. Very obviously, this pleasant arrival of wounded was staged for morale purposes. This sequence from a feature motion picture probably shows the Army hospital at its best. While Japanese civilian medical practices have been considered relatively modern, it is a fact that Japanese army medicine is no more than reasonably adequate. Many of the drugs dispensed have been discarded in European and American medical circles. Very extensive use is made of drugs that have to be injected. Field kits contain ampoules of a wide variety of sizes and shapes. Japanese military surgeons surprisingly make much use of proprietary or patent medicines. Of course, standard drugs such as quinine, aspirin, and iodine are employed. Vaccines and serums are comparable with those used in other armies, although there are indications that some of them are not very effective. Vitamin products are used extensively in the form of powders or tablets, as well as in solutions for injection. A potent morale factor is the existence of the Yasukuni Shrine. Japan has no equivalent of the Western world's unknown soldier. All are known and deified at Yasukuni. An endless stream of Japanese visits this immense shrine located on Kudan Hill, north of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. The names of those who have died on the field of battle are inscribed with great ceremony on the tablets of the inner shrine. Thus, each dead soldier becomes a lesser god, living forever as a guarding deity of the nation. To the average Japanese soldier, no higher honor could be the lot of mortal man. It is one of the prime motives for his fatalistic resignation to death. When two uniformed Japanese part, there is no light-hearted farewell such as the American "so long." Instead, the Japanese soldiers salute gravely and say to each other, "Until we meet at Yasukuni." It is, they believe, a tryst with destiny. The Japanese Army has long been aware of the difficulties of a winter campaign. Each winter in Japan, infantry like these ski troopers left barracks for the Taikan Kogun, cold endurance marches. Regiments stationed in northern and western Japan specialized in maneuvers which prepared them for winter duty along the Siberian-Manchurian border. This demonstrated high winter efficiency of the Japanese Army is a far cry from that army's performance in the Allied intervention in Siberia following World War I. American and other observers noted that the highly touted Japanese winter campaigners were amazingly ill-equipped and ill-adapted to the rigorous Siberian climate. This humiliating weakness made Japan concentrate on such tactics as the Taikan Kogun. Since the outbreak of the Manchurian incident, Japanese military forces have fought virtually every type of action under the widest variety of terrain and climatic conditions. The experience they have gained has led to important changes in tactical doctrines and practices. Definite reverses notwithstanding, the Japanese are still in a strong position. It will require a great effort to defeat this closely knit, fanatically stubborn power. Allied operations of great magnitude will be required to keep the enemy under pressure and to assemble and drive home the preponderance of force necessary to assure the complete defeat of Japan.